My husband and his dad lived off me for 4 years without paying anything. I spent $150,000 supporting them while they played video games. But when his father pushed me down the stairs and my husband just stood there, I got a restraining order and evicted them both. Now he's begging to come back. I'm 34 years old. I work as an account manager at an advertising firm. And I need to tell this story because what happened 6 months ago literally changed every aspect of my life. And honestly, I'm still processing everything. The thing is, for 4 years, 4 complete years, I was the only person putting money into my household. I paid for absolutely everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. The rent, the electricity and water bills, the food, even the toilet paper and shampoo, while my husband Stephen and my father-in-law Frank didn't contribute a single cent. But I guess I should start from the beginning. When I met Stephen like 7 years ago, because back then, things were different. Or at least I thought they were. I met Stephen at a work conference. He worked in sales for a tech company and seemed to have his life pretty together. You know, good job, kind, funny. And when we started dating, everything was perfect for the first few months. His father, Frank, was living alone at that time. Stephen's mother had passed away like 2 years before we met, and Stephen always talked about how hard that had been for his dad, how Frank had fallen into some kind of depression and had trouble keeping a steady job. I understood. I mean, losing your partner after 30 years of marriage must be devastating. And when Stephen introduced me to him, Frank seemed like a normal guy, like in his mid-60s, quiet but polite. We got married after 2 years of dating. It was a small wedding, nothing fancy, just close family and some friends, and we bought a house together. Well, technically, I bought it because I had better credit and had saved more money, but at the time, it didn't seem important because we were a team. You know what I mean? Things started to change, like 6 months after the wedding, when Stephen lost his job. The company had massive layoffs and he was out, and I told him not to worry, that I could cover expenses while he found something new. And, honestly, I thought it would be temporary, like 2 or 3 months max. But 2 months passed, then 3, then 6, and Stephen still couldn't find anything. And every time I asked him how the job search was going, he'd get defensive and say the market was tough, that nobody was calling him, that he needed time. And looking back, I should have seen it coming. The signs were there, but I ignored them, because I wanted to believe things were going to get better. Then, like a year after Stephen lost his job, Frank showed up one day with all his suitcases, and Stephen told me, "My dad is going to stay with us for a while. He lost his apartment and has nowhere to go." And I, being the idiot I was at that time, said yes because I thought it would be temporary, that Frank would get a job and leave in a few months. But turns out Frank had no intention of working. Basically, from day one, he settled into our guest room and started acting like it was his house. He left his stuff everywhere, never cleaned anything, and expected me to cook for him and wash his clothes. Stephen didn't say anything. He never asked his father to contribute or at least help with household chores. And when I tried to bring up the topic, Stephen would tell me that his father was going through a difficult time and that we needed to be patient. Months went by, and the situation became unbearable. I was literally paying for everything. The house mortgage, which was like $2,000 a month, plus utilities, which were another $300 or $400, plus food, which for 3 people was easily $600 to $800 a month, depending on what we bought, plus internet, cable, car insurance that Stephen kept using despite not having a job, plus gas, plus anything they needed. And the worst part wasn't just the money. Honestly, the worst part was that neither Stephen nor Frank showed any gratitude or any intention of changing the situation. Frank spent the whole day watching TV in the living room, eating everything in the fridge, and complaining about anything he didn't like. If the food wasn't well seasoned, if the house was too cold or too hot, if his favorite beer wasn't there. And Stephen, my husband, the man I had married, had simply become a different person. He spent the day playing video games on his computer and had basically stopped looking for work completely. I tried to talk to Stephen like 1,000 times during those years. I'd tell him, "You need to find a job. I can't keep being the only one contributing money. This isn't fair." But he always had excuses. That he was depressed, that the job market was terrible, that he needed time to find something he really liked, that I didn't understand the pressure he felt. And I, like an idiot, kept believing him, kept thinking that eventually things would change, that eventually he would go back to being the man I had fallen in love with. But the truth is that man never really existed. Or if he did exist, he completely disappeared. At some point, and I didn't realize it until it was too late. Everything exploded 6 months ago. On a Saturday morning that I remember perfectly because it was the day that literally changed my life. I had come back from the grocery store. I had spent like $250 on food for the week, and I was putting things away when Frank came into the kitchen and told me, "I need $3,000 to buy a car." Just like that, out of nowhere. Like it was the most normal thing in the world to ask me for that amount of money. I just stared at him like, what? Because on top of the $4,000 approximately that I was already spending each month maintaining that house and the two of them, now he wanted $3,000 additional dollars for a car. I told him no, that I definitely didn't have that money, that I was already paying for absolutely everything in the house, and that if he wanted a car, he needed to get a job and buy it himself. Frank got furious. Like I saw it in his eyes, that look of rage, that's scary, and he started yelling at me that I was selfish, that how was it possible that I didn't want to help my husband's family, that he had accepted me into his family and this was how I repaid him. I tried to stay calm and told him it wasn't about not wanting to help, that I simply didn't have that money available, and that it wasn't fair for him to ask me when he hadn't contributed anything in 4 years. Stephen appeared in the kitchen at that moment. He had heard the yelling, and I thought he was going to support me, that he was going to tell his father he was being unreasonable. But instead, Stephen looked at me and said, "Catherine, it's just money. My dad needs it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told Stephen we should talk in private, but Frank kept yelling, saying I was ungrateful, that I should be happy to be able to help my family. And I was fed up, completely fed up with everything. So I told Frank to shut up, that it wasn't a responsibility to support him and that he needed to get a job and stop living off me. And that's when everything went to hell. Literally. Frank came up to me. I was near the stairs that went down to the basement because the kitchen had a door that led directly to those stairs. And he pushed me. He pushed me hard, and I completely lost my balance and fell down the stairs. I don't remember exactly how many steps there were. I think like 12 or 13, but I remember perfectly the sensation of falling, of hitting myself against the wall and against the steps, and the pain in my back and in my arm when I finally reached the bottom. I lay there for a few seconds, dazed, unable to process what had just happened. And when I could finally focus my vision, I saw Frank at the top of the stairs, looking at me without any expression, without any kind of concern or remorse. Stephen was behind him, and I expected him to come running down to help me. But instead, he just stood there. I got up as best I could. My whole body hurt, but especially my left arm and back, and I climbed the stairs slowly, without looking at either of them. I went straight to my bedroom, locked the door, and sat on the bed trying to process what had just happened. My father-in-law had pushed me down the stairs. He had physically hurt me, and my husband had done absolutely nothing. He didn't come to apologize. He didn't come to ask if I was okay. Nothing. I sat there for like an hour, crying and thinking, and it was at that moment that I realized I couldn't go on like this, that if I stayed in that house, something worse was going to happen eventually. I checked my arm and it had huge bruises. My back hurt horribly every time I moved, and I knew I should go to the hospital, but I also knew that if I went, I would have to explain what happened, and that would complicate everything. I took a suitcase out of the closet and started packing. I put in clothes, important documents, my laptop, everything I could carry. And while I was packing, I could hear Frank and Stephen in the living room watching TV as if nothing had happened. I finished packing, grabbed my car keys and wallet, and left the bedroom. I passed through the living room and neither of them looked at me. They didn't even turn around when I went out the front door. I put the suitcase in the car and sat there for a few minutes, shaking, trying to decide where to go. I didn't want to go to my family because I knew they would ask me 1,000 questions, and I wasn't ready to explain everything. So I searched on my phone and found a motel that wasn't too far, like 20 minutes away, and I drove there. The motel was one of those basic places, like $60 a night, but it was clean and had what was necessary. I checked in, went up to the room, and finally let myself fall on the bed and cried. I cried like I hadn't cried in years, because I realized that the last 4 years had been a complete lie, that I had been living with 2 men who didn't respect me, who only saw me as a source of money, and that my husband, the man who supposedly loved me, had allowed his father to physically assault me and had done nothing. The next day, Sunday, I woke up with my body aching but with my mind clearer. I Googled lawyers specializing in family law and found Elizabeth, a woman in her mid-40s with excellent reviews. I sent her an email basically explaining the situation, that my father-in-law had assaulted me, that I wanted to evict them from my house because the house was in my name, and that I needed legal advice. Elizabeth responded in less than 2 hours. It was Sunday, but apparently she checked her emails, and she gave me an appointment for Monday morning. The meeting with Elizabeth was revealing. I told her everything. From the beginning. How I had been supporting Stephen and Frank for 4 years. How much money I had spent. What had happened on Saturday with the assault. Everything. Elizabeth took notes on everything. And when I finished, she looked at me and said, "Catherine, you have a very solid case, both to evict them from the house and to sue Frank for the assault, but you need evidence of everything." I told her I had bank statements from the last 4 years, where you could clearly see that I was the only one depositing money and paying all the bills. I had purchase receipts, text messages where Frank asked me for money. Basically, I had everything documented without having planned it. Elizabeth explained the process to me. First, we were going to initiate a formal eviction process because even though the house was in my name, Stephen was my husband and Frank had been living there for years, so it had to be done legally. Second, we were going to sue Frank for assault and damages, and depending on what I decided to do with my marriage, we could also initiate a divorce process. I told her I wanted to do everything: evict them, sue Frank, and divorce Stephen. Because after what had happened, there was no going back. The next few days were crazy. Elizabeth prepared all the necessary documents. I gathered all the evidence I had. I went to the doctor to have my injuries documented, which were still visible, and basically I started building my case. I also took advantage of going to the house when I knew Frank and Stephen weren't there. I had to be strategic because I didn't want to run into them, and I started taking out my most important things. Things with sentimental value, documents, some jewelry I had inherited from my grandmother, that kind of thing. I rented a small apartment, like a one-bedroom studio. Nothing luxurious, but it was mine and only mine, and little by little I was moving my belongings. Stephen called me like 3 or 4 times during that week, but I didn't answer. He sent me messages saying we needed to talk, that things had gotten out of control, that his father hadn't meant to hurt me. Pure excuses and garbage. I didn't respond to any of those messages because honestly I had nothing to say to him. Frank also tried to call me once, but obviously I didn't answer. And he blocked me after when I didn't respond, which seemed ironic to me considering he was the one who owed me money and apologies, not the other way around. Elizabeth finally served the eviction and civil lawsuit papers on a Friday afternoon. She hired a professional process server who went to the house and delivered the documents to both Frank and Stephen. I wasn't there, obviously, but the process server told me later that Frank had grabbed the papers, read them over, and literally torn them up in front of him, yelling that this was ridiculous and that he wasn't going anywhere. Stephen apparently just stood there without saying anything. The process server explained to them that tearing up the papers didn't change anything, that the legal process had already started, and that they had 30 days to vacate the property voluntarily or face a forced eviction. In those 30 days, I had no contact with either of them. I focused on my work, on setting up my new apartment, on going to therapy because I definitely needed to process everything that had happened, and on preparing for what was coming. Elizabeth kept me informed of everything. She explained to me that Frank and Stephen had hired a lawyer who basically argued that they had the right to stay in the house because they had lived there for years and because Stephen was my husband. But Elizabeth assured me that those arguments weren't going to work because the house was in my name. I had paid for everything, and we also had the assault documented. The 30 days passed, and obviously Frank and Stephen didn't move from the house. So Elizabeth initiated the forced eviction process, which involved obtaining a court order for the sheriff to go and physically remove them if necessary. The day the sheriff went to execute the order, I was there. Elizabeth had told me it was a good idea for me to be present as the property owner, and honestly, I wanted to be there. I wanted to see their faces when they realized they couldn't keep abusing me. We arrived at the house at like 9 in the morning, Elizabeth, me, and 2 sheriff's officers. We knocked on the door and Stephen opened it. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept well in days, and when he saw me, he tried to talk to me, but I just told him, "I have nothing to say to you, Stephen. The officers are here to make sure you leave." Frank appeared behind Stephen and started yelling immediately, saying this was abuse. That how could I do this to them? That we were family. And I, who had been holding everything in for years, all the frustration, all the rage, all the pain, finally exploded. I told Frank, family doesn't push people down the stairs. Family doesn't live 4 years without contributing a single cent while another person pays for absolutely everything. Family doesn't abuse others' generosity until there's nothing left. And then I looked at Stephen and told him, and you? You who supposedly loved me, who promised to be with me through thick and thin, you let your father assault me and did nothing. You chose your abusive father over your wife again and again, so don't talk to me about family because clearly you don't know what that word means. Stephen tried to say something, but one of the officers told him it was time to leave, that they had 1 hour to take out their personal belongings or everything would remain on the property and I could dispose of it. Frank kept yelling, but the officers basically ignored him and supervised, while Stephen and Frank packed what they could in a few suitcases and boxes. It was surreal to see them there, hurried, taking out clothes and things from the house that had been their comfortable refuge for years while I worked and paid for everything. And they left in Stephen's car. That car whose insurance I had been paying for years. And when they finally drove away down the street, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in 4 years. Elizabeth stayed with me while we changed the locks on the house. I had hired a locksmith who arrived like half an hour after Frank and Stephen left, and in less than 2 hours, all the locks were changed. I had new keys, and the house was finally just mine. I walked through each room after everyone left. Elizabeth had also left. And it was weird to be there alone, to see the house empty, without Stephen and Frank's things, without hearing Frank's TV at full volume or Stephen's video games. I sat in the living room and cried again. But this time it wasn't crying from pain or sadness. It was more like a cry of liberation. You know, like when you finally let go of something you'd been carrying for too long. The following months were total reconstruction. The divorce process moved quickly because Stephen had practically nothing to fight over. The house was mine. We didn't have children. There were no shared assets, really. The case against Frank for the assault took longer, but eventually we reached a settlement where he had to pay me $10,000 in damages, which honestly was peanuts compared to the $150,000 or more I had spent supporting them for 4 years. But it was something. It was an acknowledgement that what he had done was wrong. I focused on myself for the first time in years. I started going to the gym, something I had stopped doing during the marriage, because I was always tired from work and from doing everything in the house. I joined a book club, something super random but that had always interested me. I traveled alone for the first time. I went for a long weekend to a coastal town 3 hours away, and it was amazing to have that freedom to do whatever I wanted without having to worry about Frank needing something or Stephen complaining. I also got a promotion at work, senior manager, with a significant salary increase, and for the first time in years that extra money was for me, not to support 2 adults who refused to work. I decided to sell the house 2 months ago. Not because I necessarily needed the money, but because that house had too many bad memories and I wanted to start completely from scratch. I put it on the market and it sold in less than 3 weeks. The market was good at that time, and I made quite a bit of money from the sale considering I had been religiously paying the mortgage for years. With that money, I bought a new condo in an area I had always liked, closer to my work, overlooking a park, 2 bedrooms, bright, perfect. Stephen tried to contact me one last time a month ago. He sent me a long message, 3 or 4 paragraphs, saying he had finally gotten a job, that he was living with Frank in a small apartment, that he realized he had made mistakes and that he wanted to talk. I read it, thought about it for a few minutes, and then simply blocked him without responding. I didn't owe him anything, not even a response. And honestly, I have no interest in knowing about his life, or how he and Frank are doing. That chapter is completely closed. 2 weeks ago, the court finally issued the final ruling on the civil case against Frank, ordering him to pay not only the $10,000 he had already paid, but another $15,000 additional for emotional damages and legal expenses. I don't know if I'll ever see that money. Frank probably doesn't have a way to pay it, but again, it's not really about the money, it's about the principle. That a judge heard my case and determined that what they did to me was wrong. Now I'm here, in my new condo, having coffee on a Sunday morning and writing this, and I realize how different my life is compared to 6 months ago. I have peace, I have freedom, I have space to grow and to focus on what I want without having to carry the weight of 2 adults who didn't want to do anything with their lives. Sometimes I still get angry when I think about those 4 years, about all the money I spent, about all the time I wasted. But then I remember that I eventually found the courage to get out of that situation, and that's what matters. Last week, a friend asked me if I would ever forgive Steven, and honestly, I don't know the answer. Part of me feels sorry for him, for how he let himself be controlled by his father, for how he wasted years of his life doing nothing productive. But another part of me, the part that still remembers how he stood there while his father pushed me down the stairs, that part can't forgive and probably never will. And that's okay. I think I don't have to forgive to move forward with my life. I'm 34 years old, a whole life ahead of me. And for the first time in a long time, I feel excited about the future instead of overwhelmed by the present. I'm thinking about adopting a cat, something I could never do because Frank was allergic. And I'm also considering taking pottery classes because it's always seemed interesting to me, but I never had time. They're small things, I know, but they're my things, my decisions, my life, and that makes all the difference.